There's a little talk. All right. That's probably better, huh? Thank you. One of my friends wrote Merry Christmas to me today. I mean, a lot of my friends wrote it to me, but one of them was kind of like a bit of a Viva la Raza, Mexican freedom fighter type person. And they wrote Merry Christmas to me. And usually she's quick draw McGraw when it comes to being really woke. And she's really careful about her usage of language, and she's really down on people for cultural appropriation. So she wrote Merry Christmas to me. And then I wrote back. And I was just kind of having fun with her. I wrote back, Happy pagan holiday. Culturally appropriated without credit being given. And while persecuting those indigenous peoples to whom the holiday originally belonged, while also commercializing it to you too. So, I got something else I want to talk about, but pagan holiday, check. And it's kind of a little bit of a combination holiday. There's the Saturnalia Roman festival, which took place at the same time. Winter solstice festival. Then there's a whole Yule thing, which gets into Nordic cultures and Germania and the Vikings. And then the whole tree thing, straight Druidism. And so those, kind of a combination holiday, was appropriated by the Catholic Church. They had a policy that if you want people to join your religion, then they have to expend cultural capital to join your religion. They're adopting a new culture, a new worldview, and it takes something to convince them. It's like one thing if you say to somebody, "Hey, would you like to go climb? What's that like little tiny hill?" And huh?
Signal Hill.
I mean, Signal Hill is one of them. Sure, why not? I was thinking near Bixby Knolls. What's that? That little up in that area, little hill right there. Nani used to like to go there. What's that hill you like to climb, like near Bixby Knolls?
What was that?
What's that little hill you like to climb?
Signal Hill.
Is it Signal Hill?
Yeah.
Okay, so there you go. I'm wrong. You were right. If you say let's go climb Signal Hill, it's not that big of a commitment. It's a few hours. If you're creepy, then people aren't going to want to go with you. But if you're reasonably non-creepy and the person's into exercise, then it's not that big of a commitment. If alternatively you say let's go climb Everest, that's a big commitment. That's tens of thousands of dollars, months of your life, and putting your life in danger. It's a whole different ballgame. So cubic zirconias are cheaper, and Everest is more expensive to climb. So in a lot of ways, the Hare Krishna movement's the worst game in town. We're a super exotic, ancient Indian tradition, and we want you to wear pink robes and shave your head to be part of our clique. That's a lot of cultural capital you got to expend if you want to join our tribe. Do you follow this? So usually what you want to do is you want to ask for the least amount possible. You ask for people to make the least required change possible. And that way it's easy to fit in with their pre-existing lifestyle, and you kind of just, you add a little bit to what you're already doing. Does that make sense? Did you follow them? So if you want to be smooth and gain a following, the best way to do it is to add people to expend as little extra, we're going to call it cultural capital, and they have to join a new tradition as little as possible. Like you wear a suit and you just have that little collar that signifies you're a priest. As opposed to a Hasidic Jew, where you got the wild payas and you're dressing like somebody out of the 1800s, and your women have to wear weird human hair wigs when they go out in public. You know what I mean? It's a big commitment. It's a big commitment. Which is why those people live usually with each other and not with other people. They form these little ghettos, which is actually the appropriate term to use for those areas traditionally. And so they form these little areas where they all live together, because then you're not weird for having the funky long sideburns. It's called a payas. And your yarmulke, just fits right in. So the Catholic Church was smart about this. So there's a decree by one of the early popes, maybe 7th century, 8th century, something like that, where he said appropriate, he didn't use that word, but he said practice all the pagan holidays, but just Christianize them. And so that's Easter, spring equinox, bunnies, fertility goddess, Ustra, the German goddess of fertility, the whole egg thing. That's all pagan. But in the church I grew up in, the Orthodox Church, super old church, broke with the Catholics in the 11th century. In the Orthodox Church, you actually go up to the altar and the priest gives you a red egg in Easter. Red egg, the blood of the crucifixion. You crack it open, and the white inside is the resurrection. That's the symbolism. So they took a holiday which was meaningful for the pagans, and then they Christianized it. So you didn't have to give up all your holidays. You got to practice all your same holidays. If you look at Shia Islam, which is the minor version of Islam, not Sunni Islam, but Shia Islam, which is practiced in Iraq primarily. So much of what they do is Zoroastrianism. It's the way pre-Islamic, super early indigenous Persian religion. But it's just, they just have so much of that ritual which has been around forever. Or, if you look at like the Pathans, or what are called the Pashtuns, they're called Pathans in India. Pakistan used to be part of India up until, 1947. And so the Pashtun people, they practice Pashtunawali. And they have a multi-thousand-year-old code they live by, which actually supersedes in many ways their Islam. They're Islamic, but they'll never break Pashtunawali, which is why when U.S. soldiers got stuck in an Afghan village, special forces, outnumbered by local Taliban, then the villagers, because the special forces, U.S. special forces, walked into their village, the act of walking into their village meant the village now was responsible for protecting them. And so although they were Muslim, and the people they fought against were Muslim, and the people that they were fighting on behalf of were foreign invaders who come, because those foreign invaders walked into their village and were in need, then they had to give them hospitality and shelter and fight against their own countrymen to protect them. And they did. There's a kind of famous book about it, famous special forces story. I think they made a movie out of it. Right? Lone Survivor. So these Pashtun people, their culture is such that even 1,500 years ago, their people convert to Islam. They never gave up their multi-thousand-year-old code of conduct that they lived by. Same thing with Zoroastrianism in Iraq. Same thing with all the Germanic hordes and others who were converting to Catholicism, Christianity, in the first millennia after Christ. They got a chance to just keep their same festivals, which are largely based on the time of year it is, the winter solstice, the spring equinox, stuff like that. So there's a Saturnalia festival, giving gifts, feasts, it's a multi-day festival. Then, anyway, I mentioned the Yule log, the mistletoe, evergreen, the tree, presents under a tree. All that stuff is just various versions of pagan religion that predated Christianity by a lot. And it was appropriated by the Catholic Church. And then taken and forced on the indigenous peoples of Mexico. You follow? But then they just assumed it was theirs, and they didn't do the history of, wait a second, although we take it that this is ours because we were born into it, and it belongs to us. The same way people have been appropriating so much of our culture, whether it's Cinco de Mayo or Dia de las Muertes or whatever it is, what indigenous things, cacao ceremonies and whatever, all the stuff that the entheogen, the ayahuasca and the different stuff people have become in vogue to borrow. They didn't notice that they were also borrowing something. You follow? So happy pagan holiday, culturally appropriated by others without giving due respect, while persecuting the original peoples to whom the holiday belonged. You get it? Because then the church went on and persecuted all the pagans. And commercializing it, because of course Christmas is just ridiculously commercialized. So yeah, I was having some fun. I did that today. Just to give a little zinger, That's what you get when you lazily text me. Anyway, that's not what I wanted to talk about, but I figured it's Christmas. You guys came down on Christmas. So I figured I'd put a little something in there. I also don't think it's wrong to get inspired by or to borrow from or to eclectically join different traditions together. I don't think that's wrong. I do think it's important that in such syncretism, which is this joining of various traditions, you don't illogically and unreasonably and incoherently syncretize things. You got to be coherent. For instance, an all-loving deity is incompatible with an eternal hell. At least an all-loving, all-powerful deity is incompatible with an eternal hell. Because if God was all good, he'd want to give you a second chance. If he was all-powerful, he could. Therefore, an eternal hell is incompatible with an all-good, all-powerful conception of divinity. Everybody's got to follow those rules and not just spout nonsense because it's written in their book a long time ago. Because there were lots of foolish people with terrible ideas a long time ago. For instance, slavery. It's a terrible idea. It's been around for a long time. And just because it's been around for a long time doesn't in any way, shape, or form justify it. So although it's okay in my book to syncretize things and eclectically join them together, I think that's okay. At the same time, I think that everybody is required to do the arithmetic and make sure that they're not just wildly contradicting themselves as they attempt to find common ground. I was a part of a religious panel discussion that was organized by some Buddhists, and they had people from all the different religious traditions of the world there, and so I was chosen as the representative of Hinduism, and he had some Christians there as well. And they called me up, and I was just kind of kicking the tires to figure out whether I wanted to attend. And I eventually did end up attending. But I get a lot of invitations to be a part of these things, so I usually do a little pre-qualifying interview. And so I just engage the person in a little bit of a robust conversation and poke at them a little bit and see what they do. And that gives me a sense of, how legitimate they are or how serious the panel discussion is and whether we're just going to be glad-handing each other and, doing nothing of value or whether there's going to be some substance to it. So I said, what's the deal? You're like a serious Theravada Buddhist. Your tradition's Anishwar, no God, Anatma, no soul. How are you going to find common ground with the Christians? You get it? And he said, the essence of all religion is to love your neighbor as yourself. Which is straight out of the Bible. Got it? So I said, yeah, okay, that's cool. That's in the New Testament. But what Jesus actually said was, my Father had 10 commandments, I only have 2. Love God with your whole heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So the reason why you love your neighbor as yourself, because you realize everybody's a child of God. And so the first rule of the 2 things that Jesus said is the most important. And the second one is derivative and linked intrinsically to it. You have to have a conception of divinity which connects everything. Then you can love your neighbor as yourself. You get it? So what you've done is you have a half-hand logic where you want the egg, but you don't want to feed the hen. And so you cut off the hen that laid the the head of the hen that laid the golden egg, and you think you're still going to get the golden egg from it. It doesn't work like that. And so you totally illegitimately appropriated that one saying, but removed it from its larger context and rendered it effectively meaningless because you removed it from its philosophical context, its theological context. And I can't imagine any Christian would appreciate the very clumsy handling and appropriating of their tradition that you guys are doing. Guy sobered up real quick, and was and took a much different tact with me. I don't think that just because you're eclectically mashing stuff together into your own greatest hits, that exonerates you of or removes your responsibility to be a good, critical thinking person that has a reason for what they're putting together. And you don't end up taking the minor elements of a tradition and mixing with minor elements of another tradition and saying you've figured out the essence of all traditions. You got to actually put your time in and figure it out. Does that make sense? All right. So, yeah, that was a little nod to Jesus, and just a little mini hate on Catholicism, just slight. Also, my own church growing up. And something about cultural appropriation and cultural capital and expending cultural capital and how to syncretistically put stuff together and how to do it in a reasonable way and a respectful way while giving credit, and how Christianity really, you're good, don't freak out. But nice, quick draw there. You jumped up, right on it, appreciate it. Yeah, a little something about the pagan origins of what we now know as Christmas. A friend of mine posted a quote on Instagram today, which is generally speaking, where I get all my stuff. My guru just wrote to me, so I had to. I don't ever ignore him, so I just had to acknowledge his text. A friend of mine posted this thing on Instagram, and I read it and I was like, "Ooh, that's good." And there was no attribution. It wasn't, the author wasn't stated in the quote. So I copied the quote, put it into Google, which is just such an amazing facility. I mean, it's just ridiculous, the tools we have available to us now. And then research the origin of the quote. It's just mind-boggling. I mean, I have now 20 places the quote was used over 3.5 centuries. And I got the origin of it and everything, and all the misattributions of who authored it, and where it came from, and where it was first. And so, and it had this ring to me of like universal truth. I really appreciated it. And so I want to I just saw the quote for the first time in my life. So maybe you guys have heard it a million times and I'm just late to the party, but it really struck me and I really appreciated it. So the quote is, a good teacher is like a candle that consumes itself in order to give light to others. Good teacher is like a candle in that they consume themselves in order to give light to others. You guys follow? I read that and I was like, wow, that's essential, concise truth. And it has a lot of meaning for me personally. And so I thought we'd talk about that for a few minutes. Good teacher is like a candle. So we already know by the setup that we are dealing with a candle, not really the figurative use of speech, called a simile. It's a simile, which is a type of analogy, but there's other types of analogy. Simile is just one of them. Where one thing is being compared to another. And because the word like or as is used, then you know you're dealing with a simile. So a good teacher is like a candle. And then naturally, to appreciate the analogy, we have to understand what specific way a teacher is like a candle. So teachers teach, and they spend their time, which means their life, giving to others. Now, we got this whole teacher thing where you pay a teacher money and they're a hired hand and they almost work for you. And they are obliged to give you knowledge because you paid for it. You paid for the class or you paid for the course. And so in that sense, a teacher is like somebody in the service industry. You guys following this? That's not a traditional view of a teacher. Chanakya, who is kind of like an Indian Machiavelli, but super pious, who lived a couple thousand years ago, who was the teacher of Maharaj Chandragupta. Chandragupta fought Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was turned back in India. He got defeated in India. Got malaria, got defeated. They hung him up, and he got turned back in India. Could never make it past India. So the king who defeated him, who stopped him, was Chandragupta. Chandragupta was advised by Chanakya. Chanakya refused to live in the kingdom. He lived outside the kingdom. And the king had to come outside the kingdom to the hut of Chanakya to take lessons from him. You get it? So the king had to humble himself to go and learn from a teacher. And the teacher refused to live in the palatial, grounds, because then he would be beholden to the king. and he wouldn't be able to instruct them sharply and strongly the way good teachers instruct their students. Do you guys follow this? That make sense? Krishna in the Gita says you should, tad vidhi, know this. Pranipatena, by falling down. Pariprashanena, by asking questions. Sevaya, by service. Upadekshanti te jnanam. They can show you the truth. Jnaninas, they can show you knowledge. Those who have knowledge. Tattvadarshina, those who have seen the truth. They can show you knowledge. But you have to approach them with humility. That's what falling down means. Inquisitively. And you have to actually do some service. One of my friends who runs a school in Mayapur, he went to the school and now he's the headmaster of the same school. He's been there for, his whole life, since he was born. Missing an eye. Lost his eye, got an infection, has a glass eye. Sometimes he pops it out while we're talking just to mess with me. He mentioned to me that there's a universal principle, which is that if you approach a teacher in a mood of humility, and you surrender to them, and you render service to them, then they become obliged to share with you their wisdom. And that it's a reciprocal exchange. And if you don't go into the relationship like that, they're not obliged to share their secrets with you. Because a real education from a teacher to a student, especially if you're dealing with a very qualified teacher, they have an almost surgical ability to cut into you and move you forward and bring you into the very high level and give you a very high level understanding of something, even from the beginning. Like if you're an apprentice under an expert electrician, he can say, join these two wires, do this, do that, and automatically you're now operating like an expert electrician because he's telling you what to do with your hands. And then a really, really good teacher understands your whole psychology and has figured you out and so understands the way to best teach you and has several different ways they can teach and is able to pick the one which is best suited for you because they put the time in to become an educator, to study pedagogy, to study how to teach. And so they know how to get through to people. And they have the capability of giving you a piece of their heart and giving you a vision they have of the world that goes far beyond what you would ever get if you reinvented the wheel. Sitting with good teachers is like a miraculous experience. Their insight, their ability to pace you and then grab you and then move you forward. So I don't think that paying to take a course gets you that level of teaching. And when I think about, my teachers, that's when, interestingly enough, my teacher just texted me. And a lot of times I'm going to go give a class, or I'm sitting with 10 people right now. Would you like me to leave? Would you like me to stop giving class? I didn't do that now because I know what his answer is going to be. But I usually am like, do you want me to stop what I'm doing, or shall I continue doing what I'm doing and call you afterwards? I try to never tell them what time it is and what I'm going to do. They've earned more respect from me than that. And usually my straightforward interaction with them is, how can I be of service to you? And here's what's going on right now, and how would you like me to stop what I'm doing to be of service to you? Or should I continue doing what I'm doing and then, my teachers, for me, have illuminated the path of my life in a way that I could have spent 1 billion lifetimes and not figured out. They've given me access to realizations and impregnated things in me, and pierced through all my coverings and implanted things in my heart that I could have never figured out on my own. It's just fundamentally beyond my ability to have invented the stuff they shared with me. So much so, I've come to the conclusion that my teachers are in possession of revelatory knowledge that was passed down from above, and was not just the result of them being super sharp for a long period of time, but rather it was a revelation. Something was given to them from above, and then they're holding it and passing it down. And so the fee that you have, what's the fee you pay for that? It's like trying to give somebody money for that becomes almost like an insult. Becomes an insult. So what do? You give your heart, you give your service, you give your time, you give your respect. You show sincerity. Does that warrant the exchange? Not really. You don't really buy it for that price. But you show the compassionate-minded elder that you're sincere, and then they sprinkle their mercy on you. Plant seeds in your heart. Amazing things grow. It's a miracle. You got to test such teachers. It's called pariksha. Before accepting a teacher, you got to test them. At least if it's like somebody you're going to accept in the way I talked about, you got to test them to make sure that they have the knowledge, that they have the character. And there is the exchange, in a sense, is quite mutual. The teacher needs to pass on their wisdom to a qualified student, and the qualified student wants that wisdom to advance. And so it's a special exchange, the most special exchange, the most intimate exchange, the most important exchange in one's lifetime, in my opinion. And by really accepting one teacher, all of a sudden you're in a world where everything teaches you. But if you try to skip over that step, you're like that dude digging 1-foot wells thinking he's going to get water. There might be water all over the place, but unless you dug one well 100 feet deep, you don't know it. And so putting the time into developing a real relationship, in some ways you could say a monogamous relationship, a relationship with a specific teacher who has the skills and the, understanding of the topic you want to study, and also has that affection for you, where you're cut from the same cloth. It's the most valuable thing somebody can do with their life, in my opinion. Certainly the most valuable thing I do with my life. So, reflecting on this, on a good teacher, they're like a candle, because they give light to me. I wouldn't be able to see on my own. It's dark out. I can't see. But now a candle's there. All of a sudden I can see. And what was everybody used to go to sleep early at night. Why? Because you couldn't see anything. And then, Rockefeller and Standard Oil made kerosene affordable, and the whole country was lit up. Prior to that, it was whale blubber. And it was very difficult, very expensive to heat your home, to light your home. And then all of a sudden there's a nightlife, because you can do stuff at night, because you got light. So a candle is so valuable. Electricity is so valuable. It gives light, it gives warmth. And a teacher's like that. But the very nature of the teachers, that you've only got so much time in this world, you've only got so much energy in this world, You've only got so many things you can do. And so what's magical about a teacher? They give their life to helping others to see. And they consume their life and their prana and their intelligence and their energy. It's spent investing in others so that they might also see. It's such a selfless act, isn't it? Such an amazingly selfless thing to do. And I personally think that all of us need to become teachers. Which is why I think this quote is relevant for everybody. This is everybody's long game. We all need to become teachers. Now, to be a teacher, you got to have something worth teaching. So, you want to become a teacher, you got to become a student first. But you become a good student so that you can benefit yourself and ultimately benefit others, and it gives a meaning to your studentship. Is that you're preparing yourself to actually do something for other people. And so even though you're filling your cup and doing something which is very self-absorbed and very much for you, if you have this idea, and I'm going to have to give it forward to the next generation, and I'm preparing myself for that, it makes that act of nourishing yourself selfless. Did you guys follow that? Additionally, it makes you a good student, because you know you got to master the subject, you got to have good character, you got to become qualified to teach other people. And so you take a way more sober, masterful attitude towards the learning process. And you don't dilly-dally and mess around. You make use of the time you have in this world. You become a good student. You learn. You're faithful to that knowledge. You let it transform you. You become a better person. You grow through that knowledge. And there's this idea you have in your mind, I'm going to have to help other people. And that's really the only way you can actually reciprocate with your teacher, is by helping the next generation. Because the one thing your teacher can't do is help the next generation. Because they die. But because you are younger and you'll be on the planet for longer, then they keep that knowledge, that wisdom tradition alive with you, and then it's able to extend itself organically and move through time without being adulterated. Because a good teacher makes a good student, who then themselves becomes a good teacher and makes good students ad infinitum. And so really you pay back your teacher when you become a teacher yourself. Because you do for another what somebody did for you. So a good teacher is like a candle, in that they consume themselves. They extinguish themselves. They destroy themselves. You follow? Eventually there's nothing left of the candle. But that process is undergone for the sake of another, for giving light to another, for charting the course for another, for making a miracle possible in another's life. So I read this, I was instantly a fan. Fan because it filled me immediately with appreciation for my teachers. It also sobered me because it made me realize the course I've chosen, the path I've chosen, and what's going to be expected of me. And it made me realize, if you don't do this, if this isn't also your mindset, that your life is about illuminating the path for the next generation down, you've really lived a pathetic life. As far as I can see, this universal principle of teachers and universal principles of people who really teach something deep like philosophy, religion, a wisdom tradition. But arguably like some other stuff too, at least some elements of other stuff. Like I got into documentaries about alpinism, which is guys who go out and climb radical mountain faces with just what's in a rucksack by themselves and the gear they can carry in their hands by themselves. Did you watch that?
14 feet or alpine?
I watched them both. I'm actually referring to both of them. But mainly the second one, the alpinist. Yeah. It was about a kid who died at the age of 24 and some insane climbs. That he would just go out in the middle of nature and climb something no one ever climbed before in a way they never thought was possible. Just by himself with a rucksack, free climbing, thousands of feet up in the air. No one else in the world's ever done it before, and he was so skilled. Watching him move up the face of the mountain, I've never seen anything like it. It was like watching a ballerina dance. It was so. I've never seen a rock climber climbing so smoothly and confidently. And then mixed climbing, where he's climbing up ice with Cramptons and those pickaxes, and then climbing with his hands, and then going back to Cramptons and totally unattached. So if he falls at any point, he's dead. It's just wild stuff, right? But he was talking about, the lessons you learn about yourself in that situation, and confronting fear, and becoming one with the task at hand, and learning to feel the mountain, and become a part of it so that you can scale it. And having reverence for the thing that you're doing, and realizing how small you are and how great nature is, and how you're always just beneath or beholden to or at the mercy of nature. And you start talking about stuff like this. And actually I was watching something about some guy who took the 4 major rivers that come off of Mount Kailash and river after those. You see that one too? Yeah, that was really good. And so he talked about a similar thing, about becoming one with the river, and that you require the river to live, and that you're actually in a servant mode with the river, and you're not trying to conquer it. And that's the wrong way to approach these really intense, rapid sequences, because you have to be kind of submissive to the river and not trying to own it, and that'll end up getting you drowned. And at some point, guys were drowning every season, and they were doing some of the stuff people had never done before. And there's a river, and there's 3,000 foot cliffs on either side, and there's no way for a helicopter to get you. So once you go down this river, you take a few days, and you have to just simply go down the river. There's no way to walk it. There's nothing you can do except for take your kayak and go down the river, and you're at the mercy of that river. And if you decide you can't do it, there's no way to extract you. And I was listening to these guys talk about it, and I was like, wow, I was listening to them talk, and I was like, these guys are masters at what they do. And regardless of what the rest of their life is like, there's a certain reverence they have through their mastering of their particular field, even though it's not at all philosophical by nature, even though it's not at all theological by nature. There's a mastery of their craft that gives them an entrance into a certain universal knowledge. They might not have the whole thing. They didn't have the whole thing. But they had a little piece of it. And when I listen to them speaking about the lessons they learned through what they'd been through, and the gratitude they felt, and how beholden they were to the people they worked with, and how much reverence they felt towards the thing they were engaging with, whether it be a mountain or nature or the river, I was like, wow, these guys actually, I learned something from these guys. So certainly, in terms of learning philosophy and learning theology and learning a wisdom tradition, this stuff is just 100% true. But even when it comes to other fields of human endeavor, there are certain amazing lessons that people learn when they dig deep enough into a tradition and become part of it, even if it's just mountain climbing or river rafting or what have you. I think it's just, there's some universal truths you come across when you master a subject, and you learn it inside and out. And there's a certain humility that gives you for how little you know and how much you stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before you. And there's a gratitude. And you listen to these alpinists or these river rafts, like, oh, when I first went in, I thought I was, I was all about me, and I realized it was actually all about my team, and it was all about being part of a group, and it was all about having some reverence and some gratitude. Did you guys follow that? I wanted to try to demonstrate that even when studying other subjects, if you get deep enough into it, you start to butt up against some universal principles of encountering real wisdom in any field. And that's reverence and gratitude and acknowledgement that you're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's why you can see as far as you can. And the debt you owe to those people to help the next generation forward, and you saw that with these people. So anyway, I think if you don't embrace this idea that you will eventually become a teacher, number one, you won't ever become a good student. Because when you start to think, I'm going to have to teach this, you study in a totally different way. Number two, I think your life will end up being pathetic in the sense of a life half-lived, a life of going quietly into the night, a mediocre life, an entropic life, just an unremarkable life. In contrast, if you embrace this notion that I'm a student, I got to become a student, and I got to become a real student, so I can become a real teacher, so I can repay the debt I owe to my teachers and help the next generation. Even if you die in anonymity and penniless, and your life seemingly by external metrics has no consequence, you will have lived a hero's life. You'll have lived a deeply meaningful and profound and beautiful life. A life worth living. So anyway, these are the thoughts I had. A good teacher is like a candle in that they extinguish themselves, they consume themselves in order to light the way for another. The first usage of it was Charles Wiseman in his grammar book in 1764 as one of 32 samples of figurative language. In his concise guide to the English language, a new approach. And then it began to show up in sermons, in newspapers, in articles. The Turkish diplomat from the late 1800s who used it. Giovanni Rabbani, Italian author, used it as well. And then it just showed up. And it just, popularized over the decades. Every couple of decades it would show up in print until now it's showing up on Instagram. Misattributed, but the earliest usage was in 1764. Of course, by it being found in that book in 1764 as a sample of figurative language, it means that it was already in existence, and it was well known enough that it served as a regular example of a simile. And this kind of stuff happens when you get a statement like this, and we don't know where it comes from. We know the earliest reference in a piece of literature, but we don't know where it comes from. But it has such a ring of truth to it, people adopt it. They borrow it, they co-opt it. They culturally appropriate it, which is fine. That's just called appreciating somebody and being nourished by them and learning from them. That's why people make statements, so you can borrow them and make them your own. It's just when you do it without proper attribution, when you do it without proper appreciation, when you do it without proper gratitude, that it becomes cultural appropriation, misappropriation, co-opting in a negative way. And so I want to appreciate the quote by tracing out where it came from. I want to appreciate the quote by unpacking it, in that sense appropriate it, but not to do so without honoring the place where it came from, much like I critiqued that girl for wishing me a Merry Christmas without acknowledging the pagan roots of the holiday that we were celebrating. So I want to kind of correct that, show you what you're supposed to do if you want to properly recognize something. But then also demonstrate how you can take something and syncretistically borrow it and make it part of your repertoire and have it be something that now becomes part of your wisdom tradition that nourishes you. And you can do that in a way which is sane and reasonable and intellectually astute, and where you don't end up borrowing in an unfair way or just borrowing in a deleterious way. You can actually take that thing which you inherited and really own it, which is what I tried to do with the quote for you guys today, and really own it and unpack it and breathe life into it. And so you're able to show your own vision and at the same time acknowledge where you got it from. And I think that's good borrowing. And the final thing was I wanted to hit you guys with, just to recap, is I think you're all meant to be teachers. And so today you commit, I'm going to become a student. I'm going to really seriously learn a wisdom tradition, not from some hack, but from somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. And why am I going to do that? To nourish myself, and so I can eventually do something amazing like pay that forward and give back. And you shouldn't think money's going to get it for you. It's sincerity, receptivity, respect, service. Those are the things that attract the heart of a teacher. And then you skyrocket. You see things you could never see on your own. You experience things far beyond your skill level. You get uplifted and brought into the very high level by the grace of another. Then you own that new space. You make it yours. Appreciate it. Don't take it for granted. Don't lose your gratitude. And then pay it forward. And that's everybody's path. The specific tradition you study may differ. The teachers you have may differ. But the general principle that a life worth living consists of finding a deep wisdom tradition, mastering it, and then helping others to experience it. I think that's true for everybody. What else is worth doing? You know Rockefeller, just to bring it full circle, like I said, Standard Oil, the guy who made kerosene affordable and lit the country. I mean, he was an amazing person. He bought entire forests of trees so he could make the barrels and have a full vertical operation where they made the barrels they put the oil in. He bought foundries so they could make the metal rings to put around the barrels. He hired staff plumbers instead of hiring them from outside to come and work at his place. He had people on staff. He found usage for the tar that was produced through refining kerosene and used it for blacktop and paving things. Gasoline was a byproduct that was being thrown into the ocean and lakes, and he figured out a usage for that, name of the automobile. And he figured out how to refine. He bought smelly crude oil that was contaminated with sulfur that nobody would buy, and then had his chemists work on a way to refine it to remove that odor so it could be usable. Eventually his operation was so vertical that he was able to ship oil to Europe and sell oil in Russia that Russian oil tycoons could not match the price of the quality in Russia. He was able to ship from the U.S. to Russia and do it for cheaper than they were able to do it for in Russia. He amassed all, a billion, I think it was like a billionaire. It's an incredible amount of wealth, especially during that time. But he also taught Sunday school. Like for his whole life. And regularly participated in his local church and supported his local church. And actually a big chunk of his life was given to doing educational work in his church and teaching people the Bible in Sunday school. Because the richest man in the world at that time found value in just organically giving back the tradition which was deeply meaningful to him. No matter how big you are, I think a life worth living has to include this. Got to plumb the depths of reality. You got to find truth, which means find people who know truth, who can help you on that hero's journey that does not exonerate you from the responsibility of owning that truth and making it your own. And then you got to pass it on to others. That's everybody's life. If it's not, it should be, and it will be. You become a good enough student, you'll realize you got to become a teacher. It's like, even if you don't walk into it with that understanding. You walk into it with that understanding, you'll be a good student from the very beginning. Even if you walk into it without that understanding, you'll eventually get there if you go into it enough. It's one of the universal truths you'll come across. All right. Thank you very much, IGTV. Thank you very much, Facebook. Why don't you guys give me some feedback?